أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم إن الحمد لله وبه نستعين والصلاة والسلام على سيد المرسلين وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين.
Thanks for coming. Thank me for coming. And so everybody did the reading, which is great. And what we're going to do in the next couple of days is, well, today we're going to talk about the context around the life of the Prophet, and we're going to, inshallah, depending on how much time we have, either talk about kind of what's called historical critical issues around the life of the Prophet, or we'll talk about hadith criticism, depending on how much time we have. But the readings are really kind of there for your background. We're not going to spend, some of the readings we'll look at, but we're not going to, the readings are they're there for you to have the background for our discussions. Our discussions will be about other issues. Particularly, I think, we could sort of sit around and talk about the life of the Prophet for a couple of days, which would be very interesting. But considering the climate that we're in regarding issues about Islam and Muslims, I think that it's much more useful to focus on particular issues in the life of the Prophet and then kind of see how we build on those and deal with issues of controversy and that are put in our face all the time as Muslims or as people who are interested in religion or interested in how we think about truth and morality across time. So we'll talk about things like blasphemy, we'll talk about notions of authority, we'll talk about how you deal with how the Prophet dealt with religious difference and building bridges across communities, and we'll talk about slavery, which I don't condone, by the way, in case you're wondering. So that's what we focus on these issues, and not so much just like, and then this year the Prophet did this, and then this year the Prophet did this, and then that happened. Okay, but first, let's look at, still don't feel like there's, this is not what? This is not doing justice to these pictures.
Let's dim the lights.
Dim the light. Look, who cares about the recording? My voice is the pictures are the important thing, not my.
Yeah, that was.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, that's the way to go. That's the way to do it, man. Way to go. Okay. Does anyone know what this is?
Yeah. Hagia Sophia.
This is an Hagia Sophia. So the Ottomans, mashallah, not a destructive people, decided, instead of destroying these mosaics, let's just plaster over the mosaic. So that's what they did, and of course some of them have been uncovered since 1924. And this is one of Mary and Jesus. I'm not sure what, there's lots of different images of Jesus, different kind of stylistic images. This is Jesus as a child. Then there's like the image of Christ Pantocrator, which I love that word. It means like the universal king. But this is, you can see, kind of a standard Mary. I think it's Theotokos. Mary, the carrier of God, the person who's bearing God as a child. Okay, from Hagia Sophia. And the reason I bring this up is because in order to understand the life of the Prophet, you have to understand the late antique period. Late antiquity is, it's a bit of history about this periodization. Until really the 1960s and 70s, the study of the study of the ancient world and Islam were completely different areas. So people would study the classics of ancient Greece and Rome, and they would study, from the time, the ancient Greece of Homer, classical Greece of Aristotle and Aristophanes and Plato, and the Themistocles, and then they would go up to the Roman period, to the end of the Roman Revolution, from around 100 BC to around the time of the birth of Christ, when Rome goes from being a republic to quote-unquote empire. And then they would study the kind of the period of Augustan peace, the period of Antonine Rome in the 100s to the early 200s of the Common Era. And then they would have interest in the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. If you're ever interested in a really great read that'll take you about 10 years, depending on your, it's good bedtime reading. It'll really improve your vocabulary, and you'll learn a lot. The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire by Edward Gibbon, who died in 1794. 3 volumes. It's one of the most fascinating and sort of foundational works of modern history. And a lot of, when you read it, you sort of see not only the way in which the subject that this historian is studying, namely the Roman Empire, how it influences him as a writer. How he is sort of trying to revive and is almost channeling the great Roman historians like Tacitus and Ammianus Marcellinus, but then how that also informs the way historians write today. And what you see is, and this is actually very informative,
that historians are deeply influenced by what they write about. And that's important to keep in mind. Historians are not, they don't stand outside of history. They are very much part of history. Anyway, The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire by Edward Gibbon. Fascinating book. It'll take you a couple of years to read, unless you're sort of Goodwill Hunting smart, in which case you should be teaching this class, not me. But so basically, but then Islam was another issue. Islam was studied. I mentioned this in my book on Hadith, which you've all read, but the study of Islam in the West comes out of 3 channels. Sorry, people sending me messages of grievance. The study of Islam in the West comes through 3 channels. Okay, one is two are deeply colonial. Okay, so one is when the British basically begin to exercise actual administrative and military control in India in the 1750s, after the Battle of Plessis in 1757. They actually become administrators of several provinces of the Mughal Empire. And by this is fascinating, they actually are in charge of running Sharia courts in the Mughal Empire. So you have something fascinating that arises called Anglo-Mohammedan law. If you're ever interested in this, it's fascinating. We can talk about it. But one of the things they actually, the official language of British administration in India until the early to mid 1800s was Persian. And British judges had to preside over Sharia courts and administer Sharia. So they had to basically start understanding these people that they were governing. They had to understand their law, they had to understand their literature, they had to understand their history. And so some of the beginning of the study of South Asian religion, Islam in South Asia, South Asian languages, Sanskrit, Persian, this comes through the efforts of British administrators in the late 1700s. One of the director generals of the East India Company was Warren Hastings. Another person, his last name was Jones. I forget his first name. These are in addition to being administrators, they were also often scholars who pioneered the Western study of language and linguistics and religion in South Asia. So you have, this is sort of matched by French study of Islam and Muslim culture, sort of the ways of the natives of Muslims in North Africa. Because this was from 1830 onwards, Algeria was invaded and occupied by the French. And in fact, it was considered to be part of France. It was actually just a province of France. And by the way, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of European settler colonialists came from France and other European countries to settle in Algeria. of course, displacing and killing hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of Algerians, local population. So the French engage in the study of Islam and Muslims for the same exact reason. Who are these people we're governing? What are their traditions? How do they think about law? The second venue is diplomatics. And this is especially the case from roughly the 1830s through the end of the 19th century and the early 20th century, when Western countries like Europe, Belgium, Britain, Germany are increasingly involved with the Ottoman Empire at a diplomatic level. And you needed to have people who understood Ottoman politics, understood the internal geographical kind of forces of the Ottoman Empire and the political forces that they shaped. So that's a second route. The third route is really an extension of essentially biblical studies. So we have to remember that until roughly the mid-1800s, Western universities like Oxford, founded in the mid-1200s, Cambridge just a few decades later, the Sorbonne, mid-1200s. Western universities were seminaries in the sense that, I mean, they weren't literally called seminaries, but the study of anything, scholarship was religious scholarship. There wasn't secular scholarship and religious. If you went to university, Oxford University in 1290, or 1390, or 1490, or 1590, you were going to learn to study the Bible. You were going to learn to study Christian theology. You were going to learn the tools you needed to do that. So you're going to learn Latin grammar, Latin rhetoric, and the basics of logic, of basic Aristotelian logic. And along with that, that was called the trivium. Along with that, you might also have moral philosophy. And then you'd have the quadrivium, the four other subjects: music, astronomy, mathematics, and I think geometry is the fourth one, if I'm not mistaken. You can just look up the quadrivium, it's easy. So this was studying the rhetoric of Cicero, studying the logic of the translation, Boethius's translation of Porphyry's Isagoge, the introduction to Aristotle's categories. This was how you learned basic logic, how to write, how to use rhetorical language in Latin. Beginning in the 1200s, and just a little bit, you started having also the study of Greek in Western universities, and that really didn't pick up until the 1400s. My point being is that the biblical studies was studies, right? There wasn't a theology department. Everything was added on to that later on. Now, what happens beginning in the Renaissance is what could be eventually led to the historical critical study of the Bible. The idea that you're going to go back and try and reconstitute the original form of a biblical text, that you're going to think about it in its own environment, what was the purposes it served, that you think about it more as a product of its own time than as an expression of universal truth. Universal truth by the 1700s came to be seen as something that the mind and philosophers could attain, and that the Bible was an expression of truth, but it didn't contain all of truth. Truth sort of lay outside it. Part of this process, and part of what led to kind of the, in effect, marginalization of the biblical text in the greater search for truth, is that by going back and finding early manuscripts of the New Testament, the Old Testament, and seeing how the Old Testament changed over time, seeing how the New Testament was formed, and discovering new non-canonical gospels and things like that. Part of what emerged by the late 1700s was a notion that very, very important, what becomes a very important, crucial assumption in the Western study of religion, period, which is that religions are not born fully formed. Scripture isn't born intact. Scripture is built up over time, it's shaped, it's doctored, it's altered, parts are hidden, parts are taken out, things are added. And the theology or the dogma of a religion is also built over time, and that the orthodoxy isn't the original version. The orthodoxy is a later kind of, in effect, a conspiracy that hides and shuts away the earlier heterodox elements. So this is, and you can see this as early as the writings of Voltaire, for example, who died 1778. This idea that there's all these early Christian writings which don't share the orthodox positions of the Catholic Church or the Christian Church after the 300s of the Common Era. So this is sort of part of leads to the gradual secularization of European scholarship and European thinking about truth, because the Bible ceases to be an intact vessel of truth, and starts to become a historical product that is primarily meaningful in its own time and can only be mined for meaning later on because it corroborates things that we know to be meaningful from reason. So Jesus, for example, stops to be, by the time you get to the early 1800s, the mid-1800s, in the universities of Germany and France and England. Jesus is no longer important because how did that happen? Okay. Jesus is no longer important because of the details of Jesus' life, because he said this or he did that. He's important because he teaches us the moral lesson of love, of forgiveness, of humility. It's the Christ of spirit, not the Christ of history, that matters. So there's a long way to get to the point where, which is the original point I was making, which is that what happens by the late 1700s, and especially in the mid-1800s, is that European scholars, especially in the universities of Germany, the great universities of Germany like Tübingen, Heidelberg, that are reformed and strengthened by what's called the reforms of Alexander von Humboldt in the mid to late 1800s. They simply assume that they've studied the biblical tradition, and now, let's go and study other traditions. And they assume that other traditions function in exactly the same way. And there's a fascinating, the records of this conference of Western scholars, Orientalists, in the early 1900s, and this German scholar gets up and says, "We have now brought in lights to the forests of India and to the jungles of Africa." So the colonial endeavor is paired with the scholarly endeavor of uncovering the origins of other people's religions. Just as Europeans had uncovered the origins of their own religion, they would now do this for other people's religion. And that would not only help those people understand why they act the way they do and teach them truth, but it would also be part of this greater European study of everything, a categorization of all knowledge.